All right.
No, I'm not. I'm not even on the bill.
I think we'll get started here. We've got some folks here in chambers and some folks on Zoom. This is the Seminole Glen Watershed Study first public information meeting. My name is Ryan Stenjum. I am the one of the environmental engineers for the city of Fitchburg. I'm kind of leading the project on our end for the city. Ben Schulte, the other environmental engineer, is also here. So if you have questions after the meeting or somebody's watching this recording later on, feel free to reach out to us. My contact information will be in the presentation. It's obviously on the city website, or if you found your way here, you probably have it. So don't be shy about reaching out if you've got questions or comments. The city has contracted with AE2S to complete the stormwater modeling and management plan update for the Seminole Glen watershed. Anne-Marie Kirsch is here. She's the project manager for AE2S. She'll be giving kind of the presentation today. So she'll hit the highlights and go through some of the early findings of the study. And then there'll be time for kind of questions and answers at the end. Hopefully we'll do our best to get through everything. But if there's stuff that we want to talk about, like I said, feel free to reach out and send me an email or give me a call later on. So I guess the other preamble I want to give is at this point, so this is sort of the first public information meeting. We've completed stormwater modeling of the watershed. And so that means we've basically the existing current conditions in these stormwater models. We are engaging with the public now to hopefully confirm some of what we're seeing in the stormwater models, but also then after this meeting, we'll sit down and start to work through potential solutions to or modifications to how stormwater has been managed out there and maybe recommendations out of this study. So at this point, we don't have anything to present in terms of this is what's going to happen going forward, but there will be another public information meeting in the future, kind of once we model a few alternatives, I guess. So stay tuned for that. I think all the folks here are signed in. To the folks online, if you're interested in getting on the email or text distribution list, please go to the project website and you can do that. So without going on any further, I will hand it over to Anne-Marie.
Thanks, Ryan. As Ryan said, I'm one of the project managers for this project. I'm Anne-Marie Kirsch. I work at AE2S. We're a firm that specializes in water. We deal with not just stormwater runoff, but drinking water, wastewater, water supply, and distribution. So with that, our group here in the Madison office does really specialize in water resources, meaning stormwater management. And between the three of us in our Madison office, we have about a combined 70 years of experience. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit, just like Brian said, about what we've been looking at so far. And also, again, the purpose of this public information is not just for me to talk to you, but also to take input from the folks that live in the watershed and have experienced it over the last 25, 30 years as it's developed. So as we talk about, well, why are we here? Why are we here? There was a stormwater management plan done in about 2000 for Seminole Glen. And that's a long time in the world of water resources. And as we look at these aerial maps of the neighborhood, going back to 1987, the only buildings on the landscape really were the historic farmhouses in this neighborhood. You flash forward to 2000 when the original stormwater management plan was done. Well, we have a significant amount of development, but when you compare that to the current map on the far right, we've definitely seen more development. And as time goes on, not only has there been development, but there have also been some advances made in how we really look at stormwater management on the landscape. So, again, talking about updating this plan from 2000. And yes, some of these photos are taken from people who submitted them to the city, because obviously as we go through this analysis, we have to rely on what other people have seen as well. So again, it's been reported over the years that there have been significant flooding in the kettles east of Seminole Glen Park. So in addition to just long-term flooding of the kettles, which can put homes at risk, there have also been concerns about erosion and tree die-off, especially because of the long-term flooding of the kettles. There are trees that don't like wet feet for a long time. And then finally, there have been concerns about the water quality too. It's not just how much water and how fast and how long it stays, but what's in the water. Is there sediment? Is there salt? All of these can have impacts not just to the plants, but also the animals and the ecology of the wetlands. So this graph is one of my favorite graphs to bring up to people. And you don't have to be a scientist or an engineer to understand this really. This is looking at the drought severity index for south central Wisconsin. And this goes back to 1895. This is when they started keeping records on this. And where you see it's green, that means that's been a wet period, and red has been a drought. And the bigger the spike, the wetter or drier it's been. And what's really interesting about the graph is as you get to the last, slide go away. As you get to the last 20, 30, 40 years, you can see that there's been a lot more green than there has been red. So especially in an area like Seminole Glen, where long-term flooding and these kettles left by the glaciers, this amount of wetness can have even a more serious impact. So how did we get here? In October 2021, the city issued a request for proposals from firms like ours to complete the feasibility study and look at potential design concepts to mitigate the flooding in Seminole Glen kettles and evaluate the water quality. We came on board early we were contracted late last year, and now we're in early 2023, and so we're at this public involvement meeting. As we go forward, we're going to continue to collect data. We're going to revise our model to look at potential flooding and water quality impact solutions. And then we're going to have a second public involvement meeting. And as we get to the end of the spring, we're going to wrap up this project and come up with recommendations and issue a report documenting our findings to the city. So again, all of these types of projects, public improvement projects, really do rely on public input. So there, as Ryan indicated, you can contact him at ryan.stenjum@fitchburgwisconsin.gov. His phone number is also there. And he's even put together a nifty QR code that you can either snap a picture on your computer or even take a picture of this here from your phone. And this will take you to the City of Fitchburg projects website, where you can see all of the current projects for the City of Fitchburg. Okay, so why does flooding occur? The case for Seminole Glen is a little bit different from what we have for flooding in a lot of other areas of Dane County. In a lot of other areas of Dane County, it's really limited by storm sewer capacity, and you've got water running down the streets. And it's really that the pipes are acting almost like a highway, and that just can't get enough cars going through it. This case is a little bit different because the kettles are acting like bathtubs without an easy overflow path. The water goes there, it collects. So we have, in this case, more of a volume-driven flooding issue. So the other thing that happens is often when you have development, not only do you get more runoff more quickly, but you've got this volume you have to deal with. So this is just sort of an example graph saying if you have a farm field, you might have that smaller blue graph of flow rates. Once you put development in, and if you do no mitigation whatsoever, if you just build as they did maybe back in the 40s and 50s, no detention ponds, no infiltration practices, no rain gardens, you're going to get this larger spike. And you're also going to get more volume. And the area under these graphs would reflect what that runoff volume is. So in order to get something back to natural conditions or agricultural, pre-development conditions, that area between those two graphs, that's the volume of water you need to deal with. And that means by deal with it, either store it until there's capacity downstream, or figure out a way to get it downstream more quickly, or get it into the ground to infiltrate it. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through this presentation. So this slide, it's a little bit busy, and this will also be available online if you want to look at this later. This is just sort of talking about the history of how did we get to where we are in terms of stormwater management. You know, back in the day, my dad is also an engineer, different type, but you know, he graduated from college in the 60s, and you kind of look and go, yeah, 36-inch pipe looks good, build it. And then as we move forward in time, we had more tools. You know, computers became more common. We had more historical information on what is the rainfall that we should be designing for. And now we've got computer tools that we can look at this and look at it much more robustly and much more quickly and kind of look at a, well, what if scenario? What if we do this? What if we have this option as part of our design? And in the 80s, and in about 2000s, water quality also became a much bigger part of our design. Is not just dealing with, well, flooding. We also need to deal with the water quality. Again, especially in this area, nutrients such as phosphorus, nitrogen, that can be attached to sediment and affect dissolved oxygen in the water. So what do we have going on? Well, we're getting more rain. Whether it's cyclical, completely driven by people, it could be a lot of different things, but we are seeing more rain. And this is one of the challenges as a water resources engineer because our records don't go back that far. Yes, we can look at tree rings and everything, but it's not going to give us a good sense of, well, what is the peak 24-hour storm? But we are seeing things are increasing over our period of record here for south central Wisconsin. And we are also seeing more severe rain events. And it's not just anecdotal. We're seeing in recording that we're getting more and more rainfall events that are over 2 inches at a time. And these are going to be the types of storm events that really impact flooding in Seminole Glen, because the more rain, the longer it lasts, the more runoff you have, and it's getting stored in the kettles. So again, this goes back to the why we are here, and this is where I put this slide. Didn't take it away. But you can see, again, over the last 40 years, a lot more water, a lot more moisture in the soil, and the more moisture you have in your soil, the harder it is for that water to infiltrate as well. Oops. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the mechanics, and this is really hard to see because it didn't come up very well. We do have better tools and information before. You can't really see it on the left, but that's an old USGS topographic map that was developed probably back in, the 30s, 40s, looking at hillsides. We would actually delineate the drainage basins by hand and do hand calculations to try to figure out how much runoff is coming off the watershed. Now on the right, you can see we've got much better tools. I was able to go to Dane County Land Information Office and pull up what's called a raster image that represents this watershed. And you can see where the hills and the valleys are. And off to the east, that's where water starts flowing freely towards Nine Springs Creek. So again, about rainfall. How do we look at this? Again, how much rain we get, how long it lasts, this is what really matters to us. And we always talk about design standards. In Dane County, in general, we'll say, well, what's the 100-year storm? And this is also a challenging topic because people think, oh, we had a 100-year storm last year. Well, we're not due for one for another 100 years. Well, on average, yes, that's how it averages out. But we have to look at that as being, every year, there's a 1% chance risk that we're going to get that flood. 1%, which is equivalent to about 6.66 inches here in Dane County for that 1% annual chance event. Now again, well, I didn't realize that this is going to be so washed out. Seminole Glen flooding is caused by flooding volume. It's a picture of a tub overflowing, and that's exactly how we can think about this here for Seminole Glen. And again, runoff volume is a function of rainfall, depth, and then how does it functionally run off? We can all internalize that if you have a rooftop or a parking lot, you're going to see more runoff for the same rainfall event than if it had landed on, say, a cemetery or an open field. So we have all of these pieces that we're looking at. We're looking at the rainfall, what if it's running off, how much of it's getting into the ground. And even if it gets into the ground, where is it going from there? Is it really getting into the deep aquifer? Is it getting perched somewhere? Or is it shooting out the side of a hill into a stream? These are all things that can happen. And again, this is talking again about the probability. Again, it's like rolling the dice. And if we talk about a 2-year event, that has a 50-50 chance of happening in any given year. There's not a guarantee that it's going to happen every other year. But if you think about it, if there's a 50-50 chance this year and a 50-50 chance next year, well, then you have a 25% chance of getting that 2-year storm in back-to-back years. And conversely, if you don't have a 100-year event, it's like you're shaking the dice every single time. And every single time you shake that dice, you might get snake eyes. Same thing here with statistical probability for rainfall. So back to what is the purpose of this study? We're looking at specific reasons why flooding occurs in Seminole Glen and the kettles downstream. And we're going to evaluate potential solutions based on current design standards. And these could include several things. And we're also looking at water quality impacts. And part of this will be looking at less traditional hard concrete pipes, but more about, well, what can we do to try to restore the native landscape and get water back into the ground where it should be going. So, existing model conditions. I just forgot to add something there. So this is a picture of the watershed. No, it's not a picture of the watershed. I did not say that, sorry. That slide was supposed to go. So we built the model, and what does this mean? We look at the sub-watersheds. So in the yellow outline here is each of the small areas that may drain to a pipe or to one of the ponds in the park, and then they're connected together in the model by the individual storm sewers. So we look at what's coming to each of these small sections and how do they add up as the water moves downstream. So the next part of the model, like I said, is the storm sewers, and the light blue lines are showing the storm sewers through the watershed. And you can see the storm sewer infiltration system along the north side of North Stoner Prairie, going along down Schumann Drive. And because we wanted to make sure that the downstream storm sewer wasn't having an oversized impact upstream, we also modeled the lines going to the north and south before it discharges to the headwaters of Nine Springs Creek. So another part of this is looking at how big is the bathtub? How much storage volume is there in the park ponds and in the downstream kettles before you're causing risk to neighboring homes? And how long is that water going to stay in there once it gets into the kettles? And right here, this is just a graph showing that as the elevation in the kettles goes up, you have more and more storage volume. And then finally, one of the other pieces of this puzzle was the gate structure between North Stoner Prairie and Schumann Drive. So looking at this both if the gate is open and if the gate is closed, what are the impacts not only on the storm sewer system, but on flooding in the kettles. And this is a picture taken from a document put together by the previous environmental engineer here at the city of Fitchburg, just sort of talking about North Stoner Prairie and how the drainage occurred prior to development, that it drained to the north, kind of through some homes, long pipe, into the west kettle, then through the east kettle, and then eventually, west and east pond, and then eventually into the kettles. And if water gets high enough, it would get into the Schumann Drive storm sewer. And then post-development, what's interesting, and again, nobody up here was involved in the design or the development of North Stoner Prairie. We're to the point of looking at, well, what does the documentation show was constructed here? And Dane County, along with the city of Fitchburg, has a regulation in place that if you develop a parcel of land currently, we have what's the runoff, which we talked about, what's the percentage of the rain that leaves the parcel. And the opposite of that is what's the stay on? What's staying on the ground? What's getting into the ground, right? And current development standards are that you need to meet 90% of that existing stay on in order to develop your parcel. One of the conditions of this parcel was that they had to match and get as much infiltration under developed conditions as was being done prior to development. So that was a little bit extra. Again, this is looking at the documentation that we can find. So more pieces of the puzzle, again, rainfall information. This is going to be a big driver of how much flooding there's going to be. The longer the storm, the more flooding. The more rain, the more flooding. So again, typically we look at the 24-hour storms for design events here. And in doing so, that's kind of enveloping those quick, short thunderstorms that we have that might last 5 or 10 minutes and be really intense. Then maybe something a little bit longer, but not as intense rainfall. And for the 24-hour storm, again, for the 100-year in Dane County, you expect 6.7 inches, maybe about 4.2 to 4.5 for that 10-year or 10% chance event. And when we get down to the 2-year event, you're looking at maybe 2.5 inches of rain over 24 hours. Now, this is a result. This is not showing the upstream ponds, but this is what would happen if you're looking at the yellow. The outer boundary is the approximate delineation of that 100-year design storm event under existing conditions. And the blue on the inside is showing the boundary of about the 10-year event. And you can see that in either of these severe storm events, the water surface elevation is equalizing between the upper and the lower lobe of the kettles. Based on estimated elevations from the elevation data from Dane County, it looks like the home on the west end of Schumann Drive, that the patio elevation is about 995 is my understanding. But in order for water to get into the Schumann Drive storm sewer, that elevation is about 1,000 feet. So you've got about 5 feet before that water would flow into the existing storm sewer after it impacts that home. Again, estimated elevations at this point. So the question is, how much is that storage, or how much is that volume of water that you would need to deal with or get rid of so that that home being the controlling point of 995, how much water is that? And for the 100-year event, that's looking to be about 7 acre-feet of water. And what that means is that would be enough volume of water that would either cover 7 acres, 1 foot, or 1 acre, 7 feet deep. And for a point of reference, looking at these kettles here together, or the ponds in the upper part of the park, the surface area at kind of their maximum water surface elevation is about 2 acres. So if we do the mental exercise, one of the potential solutions, again, this is still a mental exercise, is this 2 acres. If you could stack those up by 3.5 feet, that would store the water and keep the elevation below the walkout basement. Or conversely, you need to find a way to infiltrate that much water, and that's a lot of water. Or figure out a way to get it into the storm sewer system. So what are our next steps? Our next steps are to finalize the existing conditions models, and a lot of that is also still going to be based on public comment and feedback based on observed flooding patterns. We're going to evaluate potential stormwater management solutions. And again, this could consist of these four things, or combinations of promoting stormwater infiltration, increasing downstream storm sewer capacity, and maybe extending storm sewer further upstream, looking at safe overflow routes. How can we get the water out without causing risk to properties? And then also the city is planning to figure out a way to manage the gate valve at North Stoner Prairie, as opposed to just having it open or closed, but really know what the impacts are of having that either open or closed. So next step is also to look at the stormwater quality and what impacts any potential improvements could make. Again, if you promote stormwater infiltration, that's going to be an improvement in the stormwater runoff quality. Then we'll hold a second public information meeting as we are winnowing down our recommendations. And then finally, documentation. Not just electronic copies of the models, but the information that was put in to develop them, what alternatives were evaluated, and what the impacts are that are quantifiable. And then finally, future design depending upon study outcomes. And with that, I thank you all for attending and taking time out of your evening. And Ryan and I will take any questions that people have or comments.
I'll just quick pipe in here. So I've got a microphone. If you've got questions here in the audience, I'll run around just so that everyone online can hear, and also pick it up for the recording later on. And then, so I think there'll be lots of interest and lots of comments and questions. So we'll try to keep the thing moving along. Go ahead.
For those that do not know me, I'm Randy Udell, alder for this particular area, and along with Jim Wheeler, he's sitting here. I had a number of listening sessions back in maybe 21, 20, and a number of residents, such as yourself, we were out there in the cold. I remember it was 2 listening sessions. It was probably just as cold as it is today. But I think couple of the biggest concerns is the ponds. They were dredged once, from my understanding, back in the 90s. And just looking at Google Maps now, and that's what I'm looking at, and if anybody walks through this particular area, which I do often, those ponds appear to be closing up. But I just didn't see it on your checklist as far as a possible dredging. And I think that's part of the concern, that the ponds are closing up. Water then isn't able to pool there, and then it overflows back down into the kettle.
And that is on the table, and maybe I should have called it out a little more explicitly, but talking about storage, and one way to increase storage is, again, dredging.
Sure.
The challenge needs to be is that even if you dredge, if that water is underneath the normal water surface elevation, that will really help with water quality, right? Because now you've got more of a pool for solids to settle in. That's why ponds need to be dredged, because all of the stuff falls out of the stormwater.
Sediment and the
Sediment
vegetation.
happens,
Yeah.
right. Mm-hmm. But on the flip side, if that dredging occurs underneath the normal water surface elevation, that's not active storage. Mm-hmm. You need to have it where that water elevation can bounce up and down for it to be effective in holding water back from downstream. But you're correct. I know that there was some subsurface investigation done in terms of what's the native soils under those ponds. And that's something we would also look at a little more in detail. One of the challenges is of the kettles that are left here by our glaciers that
Right.
they dropped all their stuff. They also dropped a lot of clay where we have these kettles. So a lot of these kettles, their native soils would be this clay lens that's not really great for getting stormwater infiltrated through.
Okay. But that is part of your study, though.
Right.
to
What can
look
we
at-
do to reduce the volume that goes downstream? And that can
Yeah.
be through storage, like I said, like upstream, like
Mm-hmm.
the ponds. It can be done through underground storage. It can be done through infiltration. It's just a matter of looking at what's effective, what's cost effective. That's the big thing, because we're talking about a pretty significant volume of water.
Sure.
The 7 acre feet.
Now, down to the kettle, back to the kettle itself, is there an actual drainage outlet in the kettle?
There is not. So it has to pond all the way up to the surface of Schuman Road at this point to get into the storm sewer inlet on
Well, and I think that's what everybody experienced in 2018 when that kettle filled up. And if you walk that kettle, I mean,
Yep.
there's some pretty good depth there.
Yes, there is.
And-
I was
But I
out
realized
there.
that storm sewer from further south was filling it up, and they shut that valve off. And I'm under the impression that valve will not be opened again, but,
That's something we want to confirm, not just through observation, but also modeling, looking at some different what-if scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
And, but that's one thing we'd also talk about, like there is no outlet right now. Is there a possibility with reconstruction of Schuman Drive to make the storm sewer larger and possibly even lower, so it would be at a lower elevation than, say, the walkout patio? So that would be the preferential path for overflow.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
sure. And then just to take this question one step further, I'm under the impression that there is a CIP out for increasing the diameter of the pipe on Schuman Drive. I don't know if you're aware of that, or I don't know if that falls within the scope of this project, but
I guess I could probably, so yes, there is money in the CIP to do design and construction on that Schuman Drive storm sewer. I think it's pretty critical to understand, well, this is related, I guess, but it's not part of that study. But this is real critical for us to make sure we're sizing that
Yeah.
storm sewer appropriately to handle enough water and make sure we're not flooding Schuman, obviously.
no, absolutely.
So yeah, it's related, and there is money in the budget to do, I believe, potentially design later this year on that. And then, construction would probably depend. I think we've got money for the storm sewer part, but the street,
Okay. I just wasn't certain about the scope of the project, and I wanted to make certain that they all might tie together as a resolution.
Exactly, and you also don't want to have the flip side and do something where you reconstruct the storm sewer and then you've still left it at the same elevation, and if you've made it bigger but the water can't get there,
Right.
it doesn't do any good.
Right.
So, typically storm sewer is close to the surface of the road because the deeper you put it, the more expensive it is to construct it. But this may be a situation where you would have a little bit deeper than typical storm sewer in order to pick up overflow from the kettle.
I guess I'll add, yes, that on the gate valve, that has been shut, and it is, the plan is to keep it shut, and then, we'll see what the recommendations and finding of the study are, but there's no current plans to change the management of that.
Okay.
And the one thing too is like, when we look at that 2018 event, I can tell an anecdote, can I?
Sure.
So I was sitting in the Fitchburg Great Dane restaurant for a West parent meeting with my husband. And we're like, oh, we shouldn't go out. The weather's going to be bad. And I'm kind of telling on my husband, too, because he's also a water resources engineer for a regulatory agency. And so we should have known better, right? And so I'm thinking, oh, I've done stormwater studies out here. We kind of know where the ridge lines are. If we stay high and dry, we'll be okay. Well, we were until we got to Whitney Way and Mineral Point, where there's a little bit of a bowl there. And a big truck came through and splashed water back at us. And I'm like, oh, no. We managed to get our vehicle home, drive the wrong way down our boulevard so we didn't have to go to the bottom of the hill, and because a bus literally floated away by Runnabon Park. and so on. And it was bad. We got the vehicle home. My husband should have let it run longer, because the next day he was taking our son to school at West and was going up the hill, and the engine went ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. Anyway, that was able to be saved. But that storm is something that we've never seen. And just to put this in perspective, on the west side of Madison, that 9 to 10 to 11 to 13 inches of rain in that short period of time is equivalent to like a 3,000-year event. So that's one of the challenges, is that is so out of the realm of what we would normally design for, because it's generally so cost prohibitive. So I just want to kind of give a scale factor on that.
I see that Scott put out, if anyone on the virtual meeting wants to chime in, you can ask via chat or raise your hand. I think we're set up for that, yep. And then I certainly can walk around with the microphone here if anybody in the room, I know. I've certainly gotten emails too, so if anybody wants to reach out that way, that's just fine too.
I can speak loudly if you don't need
It won't pick up on the...
So, yeah, we'll get it on the recording, and then anybody wants to watch this later, they'll have it.
Thanks. I know you mentioned the 100-year kind of event as a standard. I know that in recent development applications within the city of Fitchburg, 200-year has been the standard in the last 12 months from Dane County. So would you be looking at the 200-year event with this modeling, or the 100-year event?
I think we'd probably look at both, because honestly, once you have the model set up, changing the rainfall is pretty straightforward in terms of you just changing a number. And also, one thing that's kind of important to note, I think a lot of people will sometimes get in their mind that, the 200-year event has to be twice as bad as that 100-year event. But it's generally a logarithmic relationship. So you'll see, like I said, the 2-year event is 2.5 inches, and then the 10-year event is about 4.2 to 4.3. And that 100-year is about 6.7. And so then when you get up to the 200-year, you're looking at that's maybe 7.5 to 8 inches of rain. So it's not, it has a logarithmic relationship. So it does add a factor of safety, there's no doubt about it, and it's wise to be looking at these things. Because also, again, our period of record is really not that long. And the more information we have and the longer period of record we have, the better, the more confidence we can have in our analysis. And you don't know what's going to happen 30 years from now. Someday my kid's going to be up here and going, my mom didn't know what she was talking about.
Sorry, I can go.
So I actually have a video in the storm sewer from the 2018 event, and also from, I think it was a 2022-hour 100-year event. And I've, back at the time, I sent that off to Rick Eilertson, and it basically was not an issue. There was a bit of overflow in the curb gutter going down, I'd say out about 2 or 3 feet.
This is along Schumann Drive.
But only, it's got quite a good crown on it. But anyway, I'd be happy to share the video of that with you guys.
Those types of things are really helpful, because what happens when we put these models together, again, we're using a statistical rainstorm event, right? But if we have a known rainstorm event, if we can get our model to show what was seen in the field, like same thing, like think of University Avenue in Madison by the, by Hilldale all the way down to the hospital. Every time a big storm event, you see exactly what you're saying. The geysers coming out of the storm sewer. And the city of Madison's been working on that to fix that over the last 20 years.
Well,
But those observations help us.
so the storm sewer was approximately half full in both events. And the only place that there was any issue was right at the, between where it comes down the path and the interchange. And probably because the hydrodynamics of that path aren't real efficient. But it was only minor bubbling on the surface of the road. So.
Yeah, that'd be great. You can send that to me, my email address, if you'd like, and with the date stamp. I'm sure I can get it off of there, but that'll help us, you know. This isn't going to be a rigorous, like, calibration effort done with these, just because that's cost and time prohibitive usually, but having any observations that we can compare against the models are going to go a long ways towards making sure we're not missing something.
So the other thing, I think, I'm going to try and hit a few things and be as brief and focused as I can. This illustrates a really fundamental problem that we have in Fitchburg. We have a 16-acre environmental corridor. Environmental corridors aren't open space. They're part of the Dane County Water Quality Program, which is part of the Clean Water Act, and they're set aside to preserve the geological, ecological, and hydrological functions of those unique areas. They serve a lot of purposes. If you haven't read the 1996 Environmental Corridor document from the Regional Planning Commission, you should. So there's really basically three things that are an issue. So part of issuing a permit to build a place like NSPN, one of the criteria that's listed in the city's MS4 stormwater permit is that the city must look at the impacts to the ecology of the environmental corridors. And it specifically says that you can't have stormwater services installed in an environmental corridor that degrades in any significant way any of those three things: hydrology, ecology. Right? So the question is, how did this happen? The other thing is that there are three wetlands, and wetlands are protected under Wisconsin law, and they're protected with a very strong version of the precautionary principle. Precautionary principle is just first do no harm. The NR 103, the Wetland Protection Statute, says more than that. It says you will not affect the wetlands' functional values, their hydrology, their ecology, wildlife, scenic beauty, unless to a standard of a reasonable assurance the proponent of the project can prove that there is not going to be significant adverse impacts to any of those wetland protected functional values. Where were those reviews when the decision was made to dump all that stormwater from 42 acres of North Stoner Prairie into a kettle woodland? So that's one issue. Rick, I think, can confirm that the DNR has come to a conclusion that the dredging was for ecological purposes, not for stormwater purposes, and they won't allow dredging for storage. And the other issue is we're not looking at the topological changes within the park itself. So we have LIDAR from 2009. We have LIDAR from 2017. When you look at them, even within the park, taking away North Stoner Prairie, there's massive changes that have been done. The biggest being the raising of the park path across the entirety of the park. So the park initially was designed in a very, whoever designed it did a great job. The upper was one large basin, and at some point in a not too recent past before settlement, there was a small channel cut from the upper basin to the lower basin. So what they did was, is when they smoothed out that grassy area, so there was a big ridge in there, they took some of that dirt and they basically built a dam structure toward Park Hill Circle. And what that did was create a very large infiltration space. And that's the way it always used to work up until 2003 when the path got raised. So what would happen is these are ephemeral wetlands. They're relatively shallow. When the water comes in, they move out into the space. And it's an environmental corridor. It's reserved primarily for this function, which means that it really is not a park. It's owned by the stormwater utility if you look at the ordinances. And what we should be focusing on is ways to restore the function of retention of stormwater and infiltration up top. There's a lot of space. I've done the calculations. I mean, it's not that hard to do with the LiDAR data. You can store a lot of water up there, and it'll be infiltrated, just like it used to be. There's always problems, there's always issues, certainly. But that's where we should be looking. We shouldn't be looking to spend $1 million to send stuff down a storm sewer. That's exactly the wrong thing, right? The whole idea of low-impact development is store on-site in something that has some biological function and infiltrate on-site. That's what LID means. That's what green means. Doesn't mean stick it down the storm sewer. We had something that for 40 years, nearly 35 years, worked with minimal issues, infiltrated not one drop of rainwater and stormwater that's ever come into the park has ever gone down the Schumann storm sewer, ever. And it's all been infiltrated on site. That's what we should be looking for. I shake in horror when I see a picture of that kettle filled. How long? It was filled for 3 weeks when it wasn't even close to being totally full. And all the trees that are in there that are 200 years old are dying. It is a forested wetland. Do you think that's silting over it with 3 inches of silt because that's highly erodible soil going all the way down? Do you think that satisfies the wetland protection statutes? Absolutely not. Why are we doing these things, first of all? But why aren't we looking at restoring the natural function that was there? It worked for 35 years. Not one dime of storm water fees were spent on that. The other thing is, if you look at the hill that's up by the pool, if you go walk in there, the erosion is unimaginable. And it was unimaginable in the year 2000. What are we going to do about these things? Why aren't we spending money to maintain the natural assets that we have as a community? That's where we should be spending money. Why are we going to spend $1 million to put a storm sewer in when we could have been spending money all along just to maintain the facility that we have? And we didn't do it because our first initial impulse is, it's stormwater, we got to move it out. Why are we doing this?
May I respond?
Sure.
Nobody has said that we are focusing solely on gray infrastructure improvements. In fact, that's part of this process, is to look at on-site infiltration, especially in the parkland, either surface or, one of the ideas we've also looked at is, or we haven't looked at yet, we're not to the point where we're saying this is the solution, this is the magic bullet. We're looking at alternatives, and one is infiltration in the park area. And now part of this analysis is to look at how much water do we need to effectively infiltrate to achieve the goals that we're looking to achieve. So we're not dismissing this as an idea at all. And I just want you to know that, because that also plays into the water quality component. Not just the MS4, but looking at the TMDL, looking at Nine Springs Creek as the receiving body. I mean...
Well, but there's never been an overflow, ever. out onto the Schumann Drive, ever. Why are we talking about this? The design of North Stoner Prairie chopped off 19 acres of input to the wetlands. And we're still talking about putting water down Schumann storm sewer from...
Your concerns noted.
Well,
And
and the other
I
thing I want to say
understand.
is, this is a legal requirement. You may not affect the protected functional values of a wetland. It's a violation of this MS4 permit. The MS4 permit has, aside from saying you must, it says right in there, that stormwater discharges from the MS4 must comply with the provisions of NR 103. Has anybody ever read NR 103?
Yes, I'm familiar.
So,
I believe NR 103 talks about the use of kettles like this for storage of sediment. Because I had reached out to one of the DNR contacts regarding this, and that's kind of what their understanding was. Even in a pre-development condition with agriculture surrounding it.
I'm not sure what you mean by storing sediment.
Yeah, so like a pond, it stores sediment until it's dredged out.
It's not going to happen. The DNR said no dredging. It's not going to happen.
Well, maybe not from a perspective of it being a stormwater facility, but they certainly do wetland scrapes.
Certainly, yes, absolutely. If it's got a valid ecological function, and given how much erosion there's been off the hill, absolutely.
So,
But it should be done. We should be looking at how much did it cost to put that path up? Why don't we take the path down as part of a reconfiguration of that upper area? That's a natural basin. Let's not spend money down the road because the developer didn't want to put it in the first place. I
Yeah,
will mention
and I
it, but I will not go into it, but I would like to talk to the alders about this. That wasn't the design that was approved at the neighborhood level. The design at the neighborhood level was the way that it originally looked. It was going to have coming through some of the houses in a slightly different way, through the sewer and into the wetland, and there were the 3 separate watersheds within North Stoner Prairie. Can you put up the hillshade that shows North Stoner Prairie? I'm sorry, I'm getting super dry here. Can you keep going back? There was one that showed, back one's probably fine. So, you see the, right to the bottom left. Oh, sorry. So you see, the bottom left, there's a teardrop shaped. So that's a wetland. And what do we have? We have a big berm around the perimeter of the wetland. Where's the water? On the outside. Where's the infiltration capacity? On the inside. No water ever gets there to get into the ground. It all now goes through the stormwater facility from North Stoner Prairie, but we're talking about sticking either into the kettle or going down the Schumann storm sewer. And the city approved that. They did not have to, but they did.
Yeah.
I understand we need to be looking forward, but this is happening again. We've got problems at the sub-zero wetland. Similar vein. We're repeating this again and again. I'm done with that part. I get it. I'm happy to sit down and talk about all the different measurements that I've done, the observations I have from different rain events, and work toward getting that back. But the city has to realize that there are people who are very concerned about this, and it is a law. It is a rule in the city's stormwater discharge permit, and it says any violation of water quality standards must be repaired by the city. That's a condition of the NSWR permit. And the reason I'm pointing this out is, one, it's being repeated in other places. And what's happening is, every time this happens, at some point, like we are now here, the taxpayers are on the hook. If we were smarter up front and looked holistically at the development that we're approving and really getting to the point where water is stored and infiltrated into the ground, much like it is at Caravessa, although some issues there, we wouldn't have these problems. We keep looking at our environmental corridors, wetlands, and other things as ponds. We should abolish the use of ponds for things that are a regulated wetland. We have to think differently. That's my point. And I appreciate all the things you've done. I watched the thing that you did for Dunn's Marsh. Very talented person. That's not the issue here. It's this larger overarching issue. All right, I'm sorry I took up so much time.
That's all right. Go ahead if you want to just pass the microphone back.
Hi, my name's John Roach. I've lived on, just for nomenclature's sake, I'll call the two ponds in the park, the green space park, those are Kettle Ponds, and then there's the Kettle Woods, which is a much deeper, more interesting geologic formation. I live right overlooking the Kettle Woods for 34 years. And I can testify to Dave's observations. Back when those two ponds were healthier, and by the way, they had much more species in there because they had water, right? Now there's only one that has water, per se. What would happen is they would overflow, and that water would seep out into the playing fields of the park, a huge area for seepage, and it really wasn't a huge inconvenience to the neighborhood. The grass would be squishy for a couple days, okay? They might not be able to use one of the soccer fields for a couple days. But those fields don't get heavy usage anyhow, formal usage. And the Kettle Woods, which is a really interesting formation, for lack of a better term, it was very rare to see standing water any longer than a day or two. And the most common was quick melts or rainstorms in the spring before the frost was out of the ground, right? And it was a novelty in the neighborhood. And it wasn't deep at all. Now flash forward to 2016, 17, 18. When they started putting in that storm sewer, I actually wrote a note to the city engineer asking some questions. And he reassured me, he's no longer around, he reassured me with every one of my questions that it had been handled. And every single thing, and I'm not a scientist, I was just observing, everything I was worried about came to be in that Kettle Woods. And here's the tragic thing. Because of that storm sewer and that valve that was opened and dumped into that woods with no outlet, the city actually killed some of the forest of Seminole Forest, literally. Dave, I don't know how many trees are gone. I would have to say 12. I was going to say 8 to 12. Big trees that have been there 200 years, that have withstood storms and everything, but they could not withstand the city making a bad decision. And I am here for another reason, just aside from observational things, but there was never anything like the amount of water that we had in 2018, which stayed for 3 weeks. It was shocking. But I'm here, there's an old rock and roll song, once bitten, twice shy, okay? I'm here to make sure that folks know the damage that was done the last time to that Kettle Woods, and to a lesser extent, the Kettle Ponds. But what happened to that woods is tragic. And it's also territorial imperative. It's my backyard. But a lot of people are in that woods every day, biking, walking, kids playing. It's a magical little place. And it was a minor ecological tragedy. And it was bestowed on that woods by bad decisions, not, and it was a 100-year flood?
No, it was much larger than that. It was up to the 3,000.
Right.
That's why. It's one of those things. It's any storm event, you're going to have spatial and temporal variability. I know that, where we live near Hilldale, we got close to 13 inches. And
Right.
something.
No, and out toward Middleton was worse too, yeah.
Yeah,
We didn't have quite that.
In 2006, I think it was 16, we had, up on Woods Edge, in 2 hours we had 5.75 inches. And it wiped out the Schumann Greenway going into, but we had 3 feet of water in the kettle. It was roughly the same, half inch less, much more compressed time period, and there was about 2.5 feet in the kettle. So there is a substantial difference.
I'll ask a quick question of you that live next to the kettle. The last 2 or 3 years, since the gate valve's been closed, how has the standing water in the kettle looked compared to prior?
Vastly improved, because
Well,
no
I
one's
would
pumping water in there that shouldn't be there. And as Alderman Clouder observed the last time we had a hearing about it, there is no outlet there. There's nowhere for the water to go. So the notion of dumping stormwater into something that is not a lake and not a pond, it's a woods. How that happened is beyond comprehension. And so I have to say I'm in concurrence with my neighbor Dave. I just think, small things can have huge consequences. Raising that pathway screwed up the filtration model for those 2 upper ponds. And that'd be a pretty quick fix. Also, the little the nexus between the 2 ponds, that pipe's completely jammed up.
Yeah, it's an equalizer pipe to keep
Yeah,
water.
so it's just a little bit of a hot mess right now. And the final thing I'll say too is little places like that Kettle Woods and those 2 ponds and that park, that's why people want to live here. These are tremendous assets for the neighborhood and the city. And to make bad decisions that really threaten to ruin that woods, you're kind of ruining a neighborhood too. And so I just think that, especially with the kind of glacial configurations in Fitchburg, I think they have to be viewed as an asset and a natural way to solve some things. And I can just tell you, for 29 years, we never saw anything in that Kettle Woods like we saw in 2018. And we had big rainfalls here before that. Nothing like what we saw. Just shocking and tragic and dangerous, I might add. Not to mention what if it was to continue, what it would do to the homes around that woods. So that's what I had to say. And I did have 35 years of looking at it. It's beautiful. But what happened in 2018 was a total, utter outlier and tragic. And could have been prevented.
All right, well, we're a little after. Did you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to make
comments?
a couple of comments, and one that I appreciate the comments, that has been brought to the alders and the city staff. And I can say one thing is that Randy and I, we are really look at when we see these developments or they come before us, when the developers come before us, we really concentrate on stormwater. because it really affects, this district really hard. So I don't know what happened with Sterling Prairie, because I wasn't on the council, but I just want you to be assured that stormwater is something that we take very seriously. And we really, hammer the developers on where is the water going. And, we contact city staff to make sure that we're on the right path. But I thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think we're a little after 7 here. I really appreciate everyone. I know there's a lot of passion for this area. It is, I have not lived in Fitchburg, but I have walked through there and really admired it. So we're going to take this all back as a project team, and we'll digest all these comments, all the other emails and things I've gotten and phone calls, and we'll come back in a month or two, and we'll have another public meeting before this report's final, and we're looking forward to bringing that to you guys. So keep an eye on the email and text distribution list, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you for hearing us out.
All right. With that, we'll close the meeting. Thanks, everyone.